Hello again, everybody. This is our first content lecture of the semester. We'll be going over the Columbian encounter and consequences of the Columbian encounter. And just to put a definition on that, Columbia comes from the name Columbus. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about Christopher Columbus. That's what we mean when we say that. What we want to do here is I'll go over, sort of a short outline of what we're going to talk about, the environmental history of America. And that means all of the Americas, not just the United States, so North and South America, via the Columbian Exchange. The second little topic is the Portuguese and Spanish empires. Christopher Columbus, we'll go over some myths and some misconceptions about him. We'll also do Indian slavery and subjugation, and we're talking here about Bartolomé de las Casas, and the Black Legend will be one of our main points of focus. And as we're going along here, if you ever find that I'm going too fast, feel free to pause in the middle of it so you can take notes a little bit more effectively. Moving on to the second slide here, Pangea is where we'll start, and you might notice that we're starting 225 million years ago when all the continents were connected, and we have here sort of a gross drawing of North America connected to Africa and South America and Europe all together. I like to point out this underground fault line divided what is now New Jersey and West Africa. So we're looking at the Gold Coast right in this area here, just for sort of a sense of where we are in time and space. So it takes quite a while, but there's this breakup of the supercontinent that is Pangea. Ooh. So the breakup of the supercontinent about 200 million years ago, you can see how it starts to shift. And then 160 million, 120 million, 80 million, 40 million, starting to look a little bit more like it does today. And then present day, behind my big head here, this continental drift separates the land masses from each other, and this is where we get to the modern continent system that we know today. We should consult a scientist, and you can explain continental drift a little bit more fluently and eloquently than I can, but this is just the basic overview of why the continents look like they do today. And it is important to have a sense of geography because we have to know where these people are coming from. Europeans moving to the New World, Mesoamericans who lived here before Europeans ever arrived. Some of you might even know that Vikings arrived. They were the first Europeans to arrive in North America. They did that several hundred years before Columbus was even born. So here are the basic migration routes of early humans. You can see the breakup, and I'm sitting here pointing to the computer screen like you can see what I'm pointing at. And it's sort of meted out here. Every human on Earth originates from Africa, so we get this person called genetic Adam. And this is where the migrations start, and we can see down here it's about 50,000 years ago that humans started moving out of Africa. And that doesn't mean necessarily that humans made these great leaps all at once. They didn't go from just south of Ethiopia to Arabia in one generation. It takes hundreds and hundreds of generations for this to happen, and thousands of years. And if you would think about it a little bit less drastically, it would be our children. So we're living in Alamance Community College. That's where we are living. Our children would migrate only as far as, say, Greensboro. And that is as far as one generation would go to another, and that just happens over thousands and thousands of years and generations, and that's how we eventually get these large-scale migrations. And some people just settle in areas. That's why there are still African people living in Africa. But we see here on these carefully outlined migration periods, so people going up into Europe, and there's a couple routes into Europe, so that's the difference between Southern Europeans and Northern Western Europeans. And so eventually we get over here to what's called the Bering Sea in between Russia and Alaska, and that separates the modern-day United States in the form of Alaska and Russia. Well, for a long time, there was this ice bridge that existed, a land bridge that existed between Alaska and Russia, and people crossed that. We can see if we see M3 and we go down here, M3 was about 10,000 years ago. So 10,000 years ago or so is when humans first started coming into the Americas, and they make it down North America into South America, and that's generally the route that they took. That doesn't mean that it happened in a couple of years. Again, it takes thousands and thousands of years for people to migrate, and then they disperse around the continents that way. That's why when we think of these grand South American empires, they're distinct cultures from sort of the smaller tribal confederacies in some cases. In North America, it happens because those people hadn't spoken to each other in several thousand years. So those are some of the things to keep in mind as we go along here. Just in North America, to zoom in on it, these are possible migration routes because nobody is 100% sure. People 10,000 years ago didn't know how to write, so they didn't leave any written records. But this will point out some of the modern names of these Indian tribes that we might be familiar with. We'll talk about the Aztecs down here. In Mexico, you might have heard of the Hopi Indians or the Pueblo Indians living here in what's modern-day Arizona and New Mexico. Up here, towards where we live, are Cherokee Indians in North Carolina. Just south are the Chickasaw and the Choctaw. So these are some of the modern names of these Indian tribes and where they live. And just a note about the word Indian in the academic world, it is okay to say Indian again. When I was growing up, we were taught to say Native American, which is still acceptable, but oftentimes Indians or Native Americans want to be identified with their tribe rather than as an Indian in general. So to say Indian is not a derogatory word anymore unless you're in Canada, in which case you have to say First Nations. So that's just an extra note that I'd like to throw in there. And here is just a rather sweeping view of how many different Indian tribes there are in North America. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a lot of them. There are also a lot that have been left out of this map, but this kind of illustrates the diversity of peoples who were living in the New World. Well, it wasn't new to them. It was new to Europeans in the New World when Christopher Columbus arrived on the scene in 1492. So when he does arrive, we get this thing called the Columbian Exchange. This term Columbian Exchange was popularized by a scholar called Alfred Crosby, and what he's talking about here is a Columbian Exchange, goods and stuff in general that moved between Europe and Africa and North and South America. And we have just a couple of the examples here on this exchange. So in the next few slides I have a lot of examples of some of the things exchanged over this Columbian Exchange. So the first one, we have organisms. So this is Old World to New World on the left side here. When we say the Old World, we mean Europe and Africa. And on the when we say New World, we mean North and South America. And then we have on the right New World to Old World stuff. And so notice some of the stuff there. We have bees, cats, camels, chickens, cows, goats, geese, horses, pigs, pigeons. Is that spelled right? Sheep, silkworms, and water buffalo. And then from the Old World, or from the New World to the Old World, is alpacas, guinea pigs, llamas, and turkeys. So there's a lot less going to Europe and Africa from the Americas than the other way around. Other stuff, and pause it here if you need to write some of this down. Other types of organisms here, we have crops and plants. There's a lot going both ways, and I have a short story here. We took AP European History when I was in high school, and one of the questions on the AP test was which of these plants or vegetables is native to Europe, and I thought one of the options was potatoes, and I thought, of course, it's got to be potatoes because you always associate Ireland with potatoes, thinking about the Irish potato famine in the 19th century. So I thought that has to be the answer. But if we look here, I have it written down that potatoes are actually indigenous to the Americas first, and for a long time in Europe they weren't even accepted as a food because they just look like a root. Then the anecdote that goes along with potatoes is that the first major place that they tried to eat potatoes was at the court of Catherine the Great, the Tsarina, the Empress of Russia, in the late 18th century. And the chef had never seen a potato before, so he prepared it wrong. He actually prepared the root part of the potato, and it made everybody pretty sick. So for a couple hundred years, people didn't like potatoes. It wasn't a couple of decades in Europe, people didn't like potatoes because they didn't know how to cook them. So that's just, a funny story about potatoes. But you can see some of the stuff here that is crossing borders. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean is the border in this case. Also, and here's the big stuff, is infectious diseases. From the Old World to the New World, there are an awful lot of diseases going, and we have the big one highlighted here in red. Smallpox is, of course, the biggest one. And then from the New World, from the Americas to Europe and Africa, there's only two kind of minor, and I don't want to say minor, but they're minor comparatively diseases, are syphilis and this thing called yaws. And there's a couple big reasons for this. Just briefly, there aren't as many diseases that exist in the Americas as existed in Europe. And it has a lot to do with the way cities are built. And you say, well, there were cities in the Americas. Well, yes, there were. And there were diseases there, but there weren't that many cities in the Americas as compared to Europe, where you have cities everywhere. So that's a big factor in this whole disease situation. And diseases are the big deal when we're talking about exchanges during the Columbian Exchange. The biggest exchange is smallpox. That's the one that ends up wiping out up to 90% of indigenous populations in the New World, in the Americas. And when you think about why Europeans are leaving Europe to go somewhere else, to colonize somewhere else, you wonder, why didn't they try Africa first? And the answer is that they did try Africa first, but Africa has a bunch of diseases, some are listed here, that Europeans couldn't handle. So when you're talking about European colonization on Africa, there isn't a whole lot except for along the coastal areas, because once you get into mainland Africa, there are diseases there that Europeans just couldn't handle. Africans had built up immunities to them, but for the most part, Europeans had not. So that's why the New World becomes so appetizing to Europeans. So here's just some illustration of the devastation of the Indian populations by smallpox. The breadth of magnitude, we got some numbers on it. Indigenous population in 1492 was estimated to be between 90 and 110 million people in the Americas. And then if you look back into Europe, there's about 70 million people, and in Africa, there are about 50 million people. And the population drops to the present day by about 90%. In the territory that becomes the United States, there are between 2 and 10 million people living in this North American area, and it drops to less than 250,000 by the 19th century, the 19th century being the 1800s, of course. And you think, wow, that is, like a large number, and we're talking about a lot of large numbers here, between 2 and 10 million. There's no written records in the Americas when Europeans arrived, so there's little to go on. So these estimates do have to be kind of vast in this case. I wish I could find my map. And the first major European country to start this whole exploration bit is Portugal. And Portugal, they are the first to colonize, to start this colonization project. And it doesn't start in the Americas because Europeans don't know that the Americas exist yet. They start in certain Atlantic islands, and by going around the coast of Africa. And some of these Atlantic islands I'll show you images of on the next slide, but they're doing sugar plantations there because sugar is becoming an increasingly popular item in Europe that people are wanting. And they're also using slaves from Africa, so this is an early plantation system, which we'll become way more familiar with in the United States in the South once the United States becomes a country. So this is the early versions of that African slave plantation system, and it happens on Atlantic islands, and I'll point out some of them on the next map. And Portugal's exploration extension of their trading empire is why they're doing this. They want to trade more, they want to produce more goods to trade, and we have some of these early explorers. One of them, Bartolomé Diaz, he reached the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern tip of Africa. It's in modern-day South Africa. We will look at that on the map in the next slide. Vasco da Gama is another one of these early Portuguese explorers, and he's the first to travel straight from Portugal to India over a sea route. It had been done before over land, and I'll point it out on the next slide which direction they're going. So here is Bartolomé Diaz's route in this pink color. Here's the Cape of Good Hope down here, and they're mostly staying on the coastal regions. And Vasco da Gama, in this sort of darker color, went around, and you can see that they make stop along these coastal areas and finally reaching India. When we're talking about some of those early Atlantic islands where Portugal gets the plantation system started. Cape Verde Islands in this region are some of them. The Canary Islands, the Azores, these are some of the islands that you might have heard of before. This is where this plantation system that we're familiar with today really gets started. We have another map of more explorers, and these are from various countries. Starting up at the top here, we all know John Cabot sailed from England. He reached Newfoundland. It says spelled Newfoundland, but it's said Newfoundland. Vinland up here, Vineland, that is one of the early settlements of the Vikings, who came well before any later Europeans did. Some of these major Europeans that we're thinking of here. So here's some more of the routes here. Columbus, he took 4 voyages, of course, and they're listed here. His first voyage in 1492. These are the islands that he visited. Here's another voyage, and then he finally, here's his third, and then his final voyage back to the Caribbean islands. And we have some other people in here. Ferdinand Magellan, who my GPS is named after. He is the first person credited with having circumnavigated the world, even though he never actually made it all the way around in one try. He actually died in Fiji, which is, whatever that's worth. But he is credited with being the first around the world because he went both ways at one point. So that's why he gets the credit for it. And then this guy right here, Vespucci, his first name is Amerigo. And if you look at the names of these continents, America sounds a little bit like Amerigo. So Amerigo Vespucci gave his name to the New World, if you will. So these are just a couple of the explorers that we're talking about. This is modern day reenactment. You can see a modern day sailboat next to some of the early Columbian voyages. These would be the ships that they were sailing on. These ships are no larger than 60 feet long. The flagship, though, from this instance, did run aground and was destroyed. But this is just a representation of what those sailors in the late 15th century and early 16th centuries would have been sailing on. This is what their ships looked like. So what we have here is a map of what Europeans thought that the world looked like in 1474. These highlighted areas in that sort of tan color are the world that they thought existed, and the darker or the less filled in areas are what the world actually looks like. So these are the Antilles. These are islands that they knew existed here. The Canary Islands they knew existed. The Verde Islands. This right here doesn't look like much of anything. Is actually Japan, because Europeans knew that Japan existed. So over here would be Korea and China. All these sort of ugly, squiggly line looking islands out here. Europeans just didn't have very good maps in 1474. It is a misconception to think that Europeans thought that the world was flat during this time. Every European with a brain knew that the world was round just from looking at the sun. This is not it's a popular notion now that old-timey Europeans didn't know the world was round, but that's not true at all. Most, if not all, smart Europeans knew that the world was round. They just severely underestimated how big the world was. So they weren't expecting this extra continent that turned out to be North and South America to be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, or what they thought was, the meeting of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. They thought it was much, much smaller. So this is just an imagined map of what Europeans thought the world looked like in 1474. If I could find my mouse. So the next couple topics we're going to go over are Indian slavery and subjection, and we'll talk a little bit more about Bartolomé de las Casas and that black legend that I promised you. And we will probably get into the establishment of the French and Dutch colonies a little bit later. So just to get going here, I'll give you a second to write this down. Pause it if you have to. We'll start here in Mexico with the conquest of Mexico, which we put the date on that 1519. So not that long after the New World had been discovered, and you got to say it in air quotes because there were millions of people already living here that knew it existed. So this is the Aztec Empire in this pale red color that had existed for several hundred years before Europeans ever arrived. Their capital city is this place called Tenochtitlan. There was a population of roughly 200,000 people, and if you think about that, that's a pretty sizable city even today. That population number. So the person who's given credit for conquering the Aztec world is this guy Hernan Cortez, and it's a rather bloody conquest of the Aztec Empire, but he does complete it. When Cortez arrived, he ended up burning his ships to encourage his men to go forward with this expedition. So they had the motivation to go in and find new stuff because Cortez had just burned their stuff. Another misconception we want to tackle is that the Aztecs welcomed Hernan Cortez as a god and those Europeans as gods. That's a very Eurocentric way to think about it, and we don't want to do that. They did not think of them as gods. They welcomed them as guests, and they were really nice to them and gave them nice stuff because the Aztecs treated their guests nicely. They thought they were visiting emissaries. They hadn't seen Europeans before, but they had heard stories of these people in the rest of the Americas because this is, several years after many explorations. But Cortez does come in eventually, and he takes the emperor of not Mexico, the emperor of the Aztec Empire hostage, this guy named Montezuma. You might have heard of Montezuma's Revenge. So Cortez took Montezuma prisoner, and that's how the Aztec Empire ended up being conquered. And it's not that it sounds easy, but it wasn't very easy. It was actually a very bloody takeover. There's also the takeover of Peru by this other guy, Francisco Pizarro, and that's outlined. That's modern-day Peru. This is the Incan Empire, and Pizarro takes over the Incan Empire in a pretty similar fashion to the way that Cortez took over the Aztec Empire. The Incans did not think that Pizarro and the Europeans were gods. They welcomed them as hosts. So these two, Pizarro and Cortez, took over these areas, and this area becomes known as New Spain. And this, especially in the north in modern-day Mexico, you see on the map there it says Mexico City. That is Tenochtitlan. They built Mexico City right on top of Tenochtitlan. The borders are pretty much the modern-day borders, at least in the north of Mexico. We have outposts as far north as present-day New Mexico, and in the south we know that these are different countries. I'm pointing like you can see down in here. These are different countries. They speak Spanish in most of these countries, except for Brazil over on this side. We'll talk about that in a minute here. But we get, when the Spanish arrived, the enslavement of a lot of these Indian peoples who were living there with this system called the encomienda system. And that's a Spanish legal system that establishes this feudal relationship between Spanish lords and their Indian subjects. So this encomienda system, Indians were expected to work these large plantation-style estates, and in return for protection, and you have to say protection in air quotes, they would also be instructed in Catholicism and in the Spanish language. That was this large system, and it existed in South America for an awful long time. So here's the encomienda system. It sounds pretty good, I guess, to the Spanish on paper, but the reality was much, much harsher. Spanish did not treat the Indians quite as well as they said that they would. The reality ended up being that Indians died from these various diseases, smallpox especially, and these harsh living and working conditions. They ended up having to work long hours, and it was just a bad situation for everybody, every Indian involved. It wasn't so bad for the Spanish who were there. Now, the encomienda system only ended after protests from Spanish clergy and these large-scale Indian revolts. And I've been talking about this guy, Bartolomé de las Casas, for a second here, and he's become important because he had an encomienda. He was a high-ranking member of the Spanish clergy, and he ended up freeing his encomienda Indians and wrote this rather lengthy book, which we'll talk about in a minute, talking about the abuses and how these people shouldn't be treated like slaves anymore, but we'll get there. So this is the book. It's a short history of the destruction of the Indians. He becomes the first critic of New World slavery and the subjection of the Indians, and here's his picture on the right, or a painting of him on the right. So he was a member of the clergy, he was high-ranking, and he is the first of a long series of critics of the treatment of Indians in the New World. De las Casas was not the only Spaniard to ever speak out about the enslavement of Indians. Charles V, who was the King of Spain in 1582, actually forbade the enslavement of Indians. That led to these wide-scale protests from wealthy Spanish people, and it ended up in practice not being really tended to. There were still plenty of Indian slaves. Some of the excesses, though, were forbade by the king also, so some of the excessive punishments in day-to-day life for Spanish people living in the Americas and Indians who were under the rule of the Spanish, not much really changed. One of the big consequences, though, was that, and even De las Casas had said this, that Africans should be imported for the slave systems. That was one of the big deals that comes out of this whole encomienda system. De las Casas eventually, later in life, he said he opposed any kind of slavery, but that still becomes the norm in the New World. So some of the early conquests of what becomes the United States by the Spanish, the Florida in the Southwest, Fort Caroline is the first settlement in Florida. It changes hands a couple of times down here. That's one of the first settlements. St. Augustine, you'll recognize as the first permanent settlement in North America, and that's recognized as the earliest settlement in North America. Some of these other early explorers, De Soto, you see his yellow line here. He explores much of the Mississippi basin. He was part of Francisco Pizarro's army originally. He ends up leaving this legacy of destruction across the U.S. South, taking out Indian tribes as he goes. And then we have some of these other areas of exploration that you might have seen somewhere else before, so I'd like to include them in this map. Here is De Soto. Here's an early portrait of him. So this is a map of the world. At the time, we can see, this is what we recognize as the regular world. Over here in Europe, Spain in this purpley color, and Portugal in this orange color. So most of what's happening up here is Spanish, right? So here's where Pizarro took from the Incans. Here is the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico. Here's Florida, we mentioned, some of those routes along the Mississippi Basin. So that's all where Spain is taking over. That's Spanish territory. So Portugal, in this orange color, they take a lot of the coast of Brazil. You'll also notice that there is this little green area. That's from the Netherlands, so these are Dutch holdings right here. So the Netherlands becomes Dutch when you're talking about adjectively. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, Portugal was the first to start exploring. They have all these territories along the coasts of Africa. Even the Dutch have the Cape of Good Hope down here. But why are they getting so much less than Spain? Because nobody knew how big North and South America actually were. So we get this time frame where Spain and Portugal are trying to decide who gets what in the Americas, and the Pope actually issues what's known as a bull, B-U-L-L, spelled like it said. He issues this papal bull. It's called the Line of Demarcation, and it just runs a line down the center of what they thought was most of the Americas. And Brazil was pretty happy because it's much closer than Spanish territory. They just didn't know that the rest of the Americas existed at the time, so that's why they were all okay with it. So this line of demarcation is sort of an important turning point in European and American history, something to keep in mind as we go along here. So these aren't the only Europeans involved in the game. We're also going to get into France and the Netherlands a little bit more here. So this is what Europe looks like in 1550. So here's Spain and Portugal. France also becomes a big player. England, of course, we know becomes a big player because we're speaking English. Right here we have what's known as the Low Countries. The Low Countries, that would be Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg are considered the Low Countries because they sit below sea level. The regions aren't very imaginatively named all that often. And then the rest of Europe is there. The Holy Roman Empire, you'll see there's some papal states, Milan and Venice. We're not so concerned with those. But this is what Europe looks like around this time frame. And then once we get back to the New World, we're going to start seeing the French Empire. The French also want to find trade routes to Asia. They want to go north through Canada because everybody is pretty sure that there's a northern route to Asia from the Atlantic Ocean. The French don't want the same reputation that the Spanish gets in terms of treatment of Indians, but they are interested in spreading Christianity. The Jesuit order especially springs up during this time period. They're interested in proselytizing, but they don't demand anything from the Indians. They only accept, in most cases, they only accept willing converts of Indians. As long as they accept God as a god, it's cool, and this is usually cool for most Indian tribes because they were oftentimes polytheistic, and they say, sure, your god can be a god too. So that's, a form of accepting the god. There are fewer French willing to colonize on the whole, so you see this large green area of New France, what we're going to call New France here. That doesn't mean that there were French people all over the place there. It's just considered French territory, the French sphere of influence, because there are fewer French people willing to go. They set up these series of small trading posts around North America. The Dutch also, so the Dutch being from Netherlands, they're the Dutch people, they also want a route to Asia. And what ends up happening is they run into New York, what's modern day New York, and they found this territory or the city called New Amsterdam. So interestingly, New York City today was originally founded as New Amsterdam. There's a legend around this. This guy Peter Minuit purchased, and you got to say it in air quotes, the island of Manhattan for, what is it, 24 beads or something? But that's not true at all. It's very unlikely that the Indians who were there understood the concept of land ownership. Also, Manhattan was their hunting grounds, so they didn't accept it as their own land. They were just happy. They thought that the Dutch were trying to buy space to hunt on the island of Manhattan too. So that whole story of them, the Dutch purchasing Manhattan for 24 beads or whatever the case might have been, is made up. That's not true at all. So here's just an early image of New Amsterdam. This is the place that becomes New York City. You can see here with these tiny little houses, it looks kind of funny at this point. So by 1660, we have, so here's some modern states are in there just for a sense of geography, but we have these areas colonized by various European powers, and you got to look. So these explored but not settled by Europeans, that's this darker kind of tan color along the coastal areas. The not yet explored area is this pale yellow, I guess that's more of a white cream color. And then we have Spain down here in St. Augustine. That's pretty much their North American territory along the east coast. France in this green area, so that's up here in modern day Montreal and Quebec. England, they have their territory down here, which we're going to get into a little bit more next time, and some areas up here in New England. So the Netherlands still, by this point, they hold on to New Amsterdam, which later becomes New York. So here is the island of Manhattan in the early phases of its developments, and if you think about a modern map of New York City, the outline looks the same, but nothing else really looks the same. I think it's kind of cute to look at this. And just for you Nicolas Cage fans, you recognize Wall Street. Well, Wall Street, if you follow the mouse down here, was actually, there was a wall there. It was the settlement wall that protected the Dutch from Indian raids. That would happen a little bit later on. So there's that legend again. Here's a picture I took of this guy, Peter Stuyvesant. He was the first, I guess you would call him a governor of the New Amsterdam, the New Netherlands. So this is a statue in New York City today that you can go and visit. And just to bring it back to our map of Europe here, England, who we know are the big players a little bit later on, they really don't get going in this whole colonization until after what's known as the Spanish Armada, and that has a lot to do with England King Henry VIII, who some of you might have heard of, defecting from the Catholic Church and starting his own church, and the King of Spain at the behest of the Pope. It's this very long and complicated situation where the King of Spain launches an armada of ships. An armada just means a large gathering of ships to go reconquer England for the papacy, for Catholicism, and that's in 1588. And what ends up happening is that the armada, there's a large storm that sinks most of it, and then when they engage with the English ships, there were far fewer English ships, the English actually win, and after 1588 become the dominant sea power in the world, and that's when Europeans really start going heavy with their, not Europeans in general, Englishmen get really going with their New World colonization. So that's the Spanish Armada that becomes a very important turning point in history. The British, the English, for their part, they really get their practice of colonization going in Ireland. And some of you might be familiar with this before, some of you good Irish students. They get their practice there in Ireland, and they put that into actual practice when they get to the New World. So here's a map of early settlement or not a map, a picture illustration of early settlements in the New World by the British, and this is Roanoke Island. You'll see here, this is sort of a crudely drawn illustration of it. And this is a map of modern day, so northern North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. And we will pick up with that next week. And what I want to end by saying is that if anybody has any questions, feel free to send me an email or a video chat of some kind. And what I'm going to do is upload all of this to Moodle, and you'll be watching it this week. I will also open a discussion forum for anybody who has any questions and you don't want to send an email. And I encourage you to ask questions to your fellow classmates. That way we can all get to know each other a little bit better, even if we can't put names to faces or anything. It'll help us to get some discussion flowing, because we're going to have to talk to each other when we do these hack questions starting next week. So I'll open up that forum, and I encourage you, but you're not required, to chat with your colleagues on Moodle, and I will participate in any discussion too. I'll check it daily just to see if anybody has anything that they want to say about it. I hope this went well. If you have any questions or concerns, let me know, and I will see you in a week. I'm also, though, before I go, going to upload some Crash Course videos, and if you're not familiar with Crash Course, you're going to become super familiar with Crash Course. It's hosted by this guy named John Green. He's a best-selling author, but he also, with his brother, did these Crash Course videos, which are pretty entertaining, and I'll link them on our Moodle page too, and I'll write this all down and let you know on the Moodle page. All right, guys, thanks.